Hello and welcome to another edition of Campfire Stories. This week I'll be reading The Ghost Story by Susan Cooper. Let's begin.
I'm writing this in longhand, on paper, in my notebook. It's the only way to be private, you know? A computer is no place for secrets, especially my computer. And boy, does this story have to be kept secret, unless I want to be locked up as a crazy person. You'll see why. My name's Toby Waller. I don't have any brothers or sisters, but I have two hyperactive parents, Paul and Ethel Waller. I also have a hyperactive puppy called Seven, which is short for Heinz 57 Varieties. We got him from the pound, and he's a weird-looking mixture, but cheerful. My dad's a lawyer. He practices family law, which he says means trying to keep people together, though it seems to me he mostly helps them get divorced. My mom's a psychotherapist, meaning someone who talks to mixed-up people to help them straighten themselves out. A lot of her clients seem to get divorced too. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a story about divorce, though when I was little I used to worry about my mom and dad, because they shouted at each other so much. Maybe that's because they both grew up in New York City, which is a shouting kind of place. I grew up in New York too, till last year. We had this really cool apartment on the east side, and I could walk to school and play softball in the park, and when there were parades on Fifth Avenue, you could hear the music of the bands bouncing along in the distance. Outside my bedroom window, I had the branches of a maple tree, different colors all year round. I don't know what got into my parents to make them want to move. There are trees in Connecticut, said my mother. Fields, rivers, golf courses. I said, we have trees here. There will be less pollution, my father said. Less violence, a better learning environment. My father is basically a good person. The trouble is, he feels that he knows everything about everything, and that he's always right. Once, I even heard him arguing with the plumber about what kind of washer to put on our kitchen faucet. I said, I don't want to leave my friends. What friends? Said my father. I've never seen one except that kid with a ring in his ear. In Connecticut, you'll have dozens of friends. I don't want to move. That's enough, Toby. You're being childish. So they sold our city apartment, and they bought a big house with 2 acres of lawn in a place called Shady Hollow, Connecticut, where there's nothing but other big houses with 2 acres of lawn. The house has a pool and a tennis court, and next to them, a big wooden barn, though, if you ask me, my parents only call it a barn to pretend that they're living in the country instead of the suburbs. I hated it. My new school was full of jocks and princesses, all boring. In no time at all, my mom and dad had their own friends who came and played tennis on the weekends, and I'd hear their hearty outdoor laughter as I sat up in my room at my computer, writing a long journal letter to my friend Rick, the one with the earring. And then it started. The haunting. I started the computer up one morning and scrolled it up the screen to the place where I'd stopped the day before. I'd written, my dad still can't bear to lose. He's even worse here than when he was in the city. He has to beat everyone at tennis, swim more laps than Mom or me, even race me down to breakfast. It's sick, sick, sicko. And that's where I'd stopped. But on the screen, there was more. Sick, 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 sick. Do it back to him, do it back, back, back. Beat him, beat him, beat him, beat him, beat him. That was all. Just 2 lines. But where had it come from? I didn't write that. Nobody but me had been near this computer since I last wrote in it, and there's no modem to let stuff in from outside. And computers don't invent words themselves. Not yet. Where had it come from? I sat there staring at the screen, baffled, and worried too, because there was a viciousness behind those words that I didn't think I'd ever felt about my dad. And as I stared, 2 more words appeared on the screen, underneath the rest, all on their own on a new line. Kill him. I jumped up, scared. It was as if the computer were alive. I switched it off, quicker than you're supposed to, and I ran downstairs and grabbed my bike, and went out riding through Shady Hollow, along the peaceful, pretty streets all decked out with white and pink dogwood trees. Seven came lolloping along with me. He's old enough to be good at that. He keeps close to the edge inside the bike and doesn't bark at cars. When we reached the golf course, I took him for a run, and that took my mind off the computer, so I felt calmer when I came home. Seven went into the kitchen for a drink of water. It was late afternoon, a lovely spring day, with the sun still slanting down through the trees. I could hear voices and laughter from the porch, so I knew the grown-ups must have finished their tennis game and be sitting out there having a drink. My father was laughing really loudly, so he must have won. He's a good, strong tennis player, really into competitions and tournaments, most of which he wins, and he's always trying to get me involved. I'm big for my age and pretty well coordinated, and he can't understand why I don't want to be like him and train to be a terrific, fierce tennis player and win. I kept away from the porch. Seven came prancing out with an old tennis ball in his mouth, so I threw it for him, to and fro over the lawn, down toward the pool and the tennis court. On the last throw, the ball fell into the pool, and Seven jumped in and swam after it, holding his chin up and puffing. He scrambled out all wet and skinny with the ball in his mouth, shook himself, dropped the ball, and barked at me hopefully. Then suddenly, he froze. He was on the side of the pool nearest the tennis court, which has a wire fence around it to keep balls from bouncing out. He stood there staring at the court. His ears went back and his tail stopped waving, and he began to growl softly, a long, low, threatening sound I'd never even heard him make before. It was blood-curdling. "Seven, stop it! What's wrong?" I went to him and tried to rub his head, but he took no notice. It was as if he didn't know I was there. The horrible, low growling went on at the back of his throat, but at the same time he must have been scared, because he cringed down toward the ground and began backing slowly away. Then he gave one short, high bark and turned and ran for the house. It was truly weird. I went through the gate in the fence and onto the tennis court, and peered into the bushes on the other side in case there was a raccoon hiding, or another dog. Not that Seven was afraid of raccoons or dogs or anything else. Not usually. There was nothing there, no sign of any living creature, only a crumpled white towel, a few yellow balls, and a couple of rackets leaning against the fence. Some of my father's friends aren't as passionately careful about their equipment as he is. I do know all the rules of tennis and how to serve and hit overheads and drop shots and lobs and all the rest. You can hardly escape it in our family. My father had me take private lessons 2 years ago, and there's a tennis team for my age group at this new school, though I was determined to keep away from it, and from all these suburban whiz kids who'd been playing on the family court since they were 4 years old. I walked back across the court now and picked up one of the rackets and a couple of balls. Nobody was looking, so I went to the baseline and served a ball, just to see if I still remembered how. It wasn't a bad serve, but it hit the edge of the net. I served the second ball, and it went over the net quite fast and bounced in the service court, so I was pleased with myself. And then the ball came back to me. I was so surprised I didn't make any effort to hit it. I stood there gaping, and the ball hit the ground to one side of me, well inside the line, and bounced gently away. I looked at it. I looked at the empty court across the net. I thought, some serve, Toby. I must have hit it so hard that it hit the back fence after its first bounce and came back at me from there. I knew as I thought this that it wasn't really possible, but I didn't know what else to think. Would you? I picked up the ball, and for a long time I held it in one hand and the racket in the other. There was no sound anywhere, except a blue jay squawking in a tree across the yard. Then I took a deep breath, and I served. I took care not to hit as hard as I had before. It was a gentle serve, and there was no way the ball could have hit the back fence hard enough to bounce off. I saw it go over the net and hit the ground, and then I saw it coming back at me, high and slow in a long, lazy lob. I suppose my few tennis lessons had given me enough instinct for the game that I didn't stop to be amazed this time. I just did what you're supposed to do to a lob, which is run where it is and smash it back across the net, with an overhead so hard and fast that it's unreturnable. And I reached it and wound my racket backward, and I hit. And the ball came back to me, low and swift to the cross court, so fast that I could only stand there helpless, watching as it bounced from the ground to the fence and then trickled gently into stillness. I stood there, looking at it. "Hi, Toby. You gonna take up tennis? I thought your dad said you were a lost cause." It was one of Dad's tennis partners, Mr. Patterson from next door, a big, easygoing bald man who'd played football for Dartmouth 100 years ago. I liked him. He talked to kids as if they were people. He came onto the court and picked up the towel and a racket. I thrust the other racket at him hastily. "I was just hitting a few balls. I'll get them for you." I ran to pick up the balls behind me, and then the one lying on the other side of the court. I hesitated before I picked it up and looked nervously around, but there was nothing, nobody to be seen. Maybe it hadn't happened. Maybe I'd imagined it. Fat chance. Mr. Patterson grinned at me as I handed him the balls. You let me know if you ever want someone to hit them back. I'm not so high-powered as your father. Thanks, I said. He was a nice guy. He knew about Dad and pressure and winning. Thanks, Mr. Patterson, but I'm not really into tennis. I was, though, already, in spite of myself. Before I went to bed that night, I switched on my computer and opened, very nervously, the file holding my letter to Rick. There it was, just as I'd left it when I stopped writing. He has to beat everyone at tennis, swim more laps than Mom or me, even race me down to breakfast. It's sick, sick, sicko. But that was all. The extra lines, the mystery lines, weren't there anymore. Instead, there was just one word. Sorry. I blinked at it, and I heard myself say in a sort of husky whisper, "That's okay." I guess it was the moment when I first let myself believe I was talking to a ghost. I switched off the computer, but just before the power died, one more line appeared on the screen, and just for an instant, just long enough for me to read it. It said, "Good overhead. Angle it next time." Then, the screen went blank. Early the next morning before school, after my parents had driven off to the station for their commuter train to New York, I went down to the tennis court. I shut Seven in the kitchen, even though it hurt his feelings. With me, I took a can of balls and my tennis racket, which had been lying at the back of my closet for a long time. I hit a ball over the net, and it came back to me, and for half an hour I rallied with my invisible opponent. After the first shock of accepting the impossible, it was amazing how fast I got used to the idea of playing tennis with someone who wasn't there. You couldn't call it playing, really. It was practicing. He, I don't know why, but I assumed it was a he, would send me the same shot time after time until I gave it a really good return. Then he'd switch to another kind of shot and do the same, and then come back to the first. Because I couldn't see or hear him, there was the constant challenge of trying to guess where he was, and it fascinated me. I didn't realize at the time that it was the best possible training for anticipating where a real opponent might start heading, so that you could send a ball neatly to a part of the court he or she couldn't reach. But I didn't yet know that he was training me. I was just having fun. Every weekday before school, I took my racket to the court, if it wasn't raining, and every day after school until my parents came home from work. Seven couldn't understand it at all. He wouldn't go near the tennis court when I was playing, but would lie mournfully outside the house, waiting for me, and then jump about trying to lick me all over, as if I'd come back from a long, dangerous journey. Well, perhaps I had. The only other person around was our part-time housekeeper, Maria, a chubby, smiling lady who loved cooking and polishing, and she couldn't have cared less whether I was hitting tennis balls or roping buffalo, so long as I ate a handful of her chocolate chip cookies when I came in. The practicing became a part of my life, a real habit. The better I got, the more I enjoyed it. Every so often, an encouraging few words would flash through the computer. "Great lob yesterday," or "Try topspin on your ground strokes." The only thing that bothered me on the court was that once in a while, if I made a stupid shot or was too slow getting the hang of something, the ball would come zipping across the net hard and fast and vicious, straight for my head. I always managed to dodge, but it was frightening, like a sign of a mad rage under the surface that might at any moment break out. Always, after it happened, there would be a contrite little "sorry" on the computer screen that night. My father had been wrong about my making friends in Connecticut. At school, I was a loner, an oddball, the New York kid who read a lot and liked the wrong kind of music. The girls giggled, and the boys left me to myself, so it was only by accident that they found out about the tennis. Our physics teacher, Mr. Dimitrick, a fiery little dark guy with a big mustache, was at heart an inventor. He loved making machines to demonstrate scientific principles, and he divided our class into 3 groups, each of which had to take apart some existing machine and make it better. Presumably because Dimitrick was also one of the school tennis coaches, the machine my group was given was one of those gadgets that shoot tennis balls across the net for you to hit back when you need to practice and haven't got a partner. With help, the group managed to find out how this thing worked, demolishing it in the process, and then put it back together again. I can't say I was a very useful presence, because math and science are definitely not my thing. I hung about on the edge while they trundled it out to one of the school tennis courts to show Dimitrik what they had done. So I was the one sent to do the donkey work of collecting the balls the thing spewed out. Dimitrik handed me a tennis racket. "Never mind if you can't hit them," he said benevolently. "You can just catch them and pitch them back." I went to the other side of the net, and I looked at the racket in my hand, and I thought, I won't use this. I'm not one of the jocks. I don't want to be one of the jocks. I'll just catch the balls as they come, or fumble for them, and everyone can snigger at the city nerd. But something stopped me. It was as if that racket were glued to my hand. "Here we go!" someone yelled, and they switched on the machine, and the balls started shooting one by one over the net. And one by one, I hit them back. Beautifully. I hit them back every which way. Top spin forehand, slow spin, slice backhand, deep overhand, high lob. I knew I was showing off, but I couldn't stop. On the far side of the net, everyone was staring at me. They'd forgotten their ball-throwing machine. They were so startled by seeing the New York wimp turned into tennis Superman. I was pretty startled too. I hadn't realized how much I had learned. When the supply of balls ran out, and I'd hit the last one back with a spectacular topspin forehand down the line, I strolled back to the stunned group, and Mr. Dimitrik came to meet me. "You never told me you could hit a ball like that," he said. I said, "Nobody ever asked." He said, "Can you come to tennis practice tonight?" So, before long, I found myself the youngest member of the school tennis team, beating people 2 or 3 years older than me. My invisible coach seemed to know this without being told, and he got even more fierce and demanding in the morning practices that were all we had now, the afternoons being taken up by school practice. My parents found out too, of course. Mr. Patterson heard from his daughter and told them. My father was furious. "What's the matter with you? I have to hear from my neighbor that my son's the star of the tennis team?" "I'm not a star," I said. "I'm not allowed to be proud of you?" He was so cross he didn't sound proud at all. My mother said to me later, reproachfully, "He just wants to feel he can be helpful to you, darling. I mean, you know how fond of tennis he is." I thought, "You mean you know how fond of winning he is?" But I didn't say so. I didn't have to. It wasn't 10 days before my father, one Saturday, when he and my mother had just beaten the Pattersons on our court, called me out of the house to challenge me to a game. "I'm doing homework, Dad." He was outside, shouting up to my window. "So do it later. Come on, Toby, take an hour off for Pete's sake. 3 sets. Show me how good you are. You scared I might beat you?" I sighed and shut down my computer. In the instant before the screen went dark, a line of words flashed across it. "Kill him, kill him, kill him." Then it was gone. It was the fury again, the viciousness. Shaken, I took my racket and went out to play with my father. It was a hard match. He won the first set because he was going all out, playing really good tennis. I won the second set because he's 30 years older than me, and he'd already played a full game of doubles that morning. In the third set, he was fighting back furiously, but so was I. I could feel my invisible coach inside my mind, screaming at me, and my own adrenaline pumping at the same time, pushing me to try to win. But at the last moment, I caught sight of my dad's face, tortured, really tortured with effort, and I knew I must be looking the same, and I suddenly hated it. The whole thing, the competitiveness, the urge to be better than anyone else. I just didn't want to care as much about winning as he did. So I relaxed just enough to take the fierceness out of the ball I was serving, and my father won not only that point, but the whole game. He was delighted, of course. He was out of breath and dripping with sweat, but he ran toward me and actually jumped over the net as if he were champion at Wimbledon or something. "Great game, Toby," he said, and he put his arm over my shoulder. "Keep trying, and you might even be as good as your old man someday." I looked up and saw my mother wince as she heard him. She waited till he'd gone beaming over to be congratulated by the Pattersons, and then she came and gave me a long hug. She didn't need to say anything. We both knew what he was like. I didn't dare switch on my computer that evening, or for the whole of the next day, because I knew what my ghost would say. He was still furious 2 days later, and the moment I pressed the switch and the screen grew bright, I saw nothing but a long, angry, unbroken sequence of words. "Stupid, stupid, 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 stupid." I tried to type sorry, but he wouldn't let me in. The same word flowed across the screen, endless, and then the screen went blank, as if my ghost had gone into a sulk and persuaded the computer to do the same. I tried to reach him the next day, too, out on the tennis court in the bright early morning, but he was clearly refusing to practice with me, and no ball that I hit over the net was returned. They just bounced and lay still. "Hey, come on!" I shouted into the air. "I need my coach! Don't be mad at me!" But he was mad. Seriously mad. I could feel the anger in the air, prickling all around me like the electricity you can sense in a bad thunderstorm. There was something about his constant, seething rage that was far more frightening even than the idea of a ghost itself. For the first time, I began to wonder who he was, or who he had been. I said to my mother that night, "Who lived in this house before we did?" "A nice old lady called Farrell. She moved to Florida. She said she was glad a happy family was moving in." She set the microwave oven time and suddenly looked me in the eye. "Are you happy here, Toby?" I said. Sure I am." "You look good, healthy, and you smile more." "I do?" "Yes." She gave me a quick hug. "He can't help the way he is, you know. Maybe none of us can." "I know." I hugged her back, just for a moment, and I thought, my father or my ghost? That weekend, I went out on my bike and saw Mr. Patterson tinkering with his tractor lawnmower. He loved mowing his own lawn. He waved to me, and I went over, and because it was him, I said just what was in my head. "Mr. Patterson, did anybody really angry ever live in our house?" His hands stopped moving, and he stared at me with his mouth half open. He said, after a moment, "Why?" "I just wondered." Mr. Patterson leaned against the tractor and resettled his baseball cap on his bald head. The eyes in that cheerful face were direct and serious, fixed on me. "Well," he said. "Well, it's not a pretty story, but maybe you need to know." I said, "Yes, please." Mr. Patterson said, "It was about 40 years ago when I was a kid. The family in your house had a boy older than you, about 16, I guess, and a girl much younger, and the mother was a quiet, gentle soul. But the father was a horror. A cold, hard man with a vicious temper. He'd been in the Marines in World War II, and I think his mind was still stuck there. He ran that house like a military jail. The kids, the mother, they all had to come when he whistled, and if they crossed him, he was terrible. A violent man." He paused, looking into the past, and shook his head. "The boy was gentle, like his mother, but he had his father's temper. One night, they had a terrible row. The father had been drinking, I think, and he'd got mad at the little girl and hit her in the face. The boy went into a terrible rage. I guess he wanted to kill his father, and he grabbed his little sister and ran out of the house with her, furious, and drove off like a maniac in his father's car. And he hit a tree, and he and the little girl were both killed. I flinched as if he'd hit me. Like a long noise at the back of my mind, I could feel my ghost's pain and fear and the endless, unresolved rage. The father disappeared the next day, Mr. Patterson said. Just went away. Nobody ever found out what happened to him. Poor Mrs. Farrell. She stayed on in the house, but she was like a shadow of a person. I said, "Did the boy play tennis?" "They built that court for him," Mr. Patterson said. "He was on his way to being junior national champion. His father used to drive him as if he were flogging a racehorse." "What was the boy's name?" "Jimmy," Mr. Patterson said. Our tennis team won the regional championship, and I won the singles for my age group. Then it was summer vacation. My father wanted me to go to tennis camp and couldn't understand why I didn't want to leave home. He also couldn't understand why I wouldn't practice with him, why I went off to play with kids on school courts instead. I couldn't explain to him that whenever he and I set foot together on our own court, the great wave of rage I felt flooding out from my ghost was intolerable. I couldn't bear it. I felt it would drive me mad. And rage was the only thing I sensed these days. There was no more coaching. It was as if the tennis game that I'd lost, that my father had won, had fixed Jimmy forever in the terrible, angry resentment that had killed him. Then my father and Mr. Patterson did something I couldn't escape. They organized a neighborhood tennis tournament to be played on our court. There were no age or sex barriers. Everyone played everyone else. And because I had to play to win for fear of sending my invisible coach over who knew what edge of insane fury, I found myself, at the end, matched in the singles final against my father. We stood there, on either side of the net, facing each other, with dozens of people lined up on chairs outside the fence, watching. I could see my mother, looking very unhappy. My father grinned at me and spat on his hands. "Okay, kid," he called. "Let's see what you're made of." It was a long, fierce, terrifying game. Terrifying because of my dad's passionate, urgent longing to beat his son, which was embarrassingly obvious to everyone, and because of the great wave of rage against him filling the whole court, which nobody could sense but me. We both played amazingly well. All the time I could feel Jimmy pushing me on, fiercely urging me to win. My father won the first set. I won the second. He won the third. I won the fourth. He was breathing heavily by now, getting tired. Then we were 5-4 in the last set, and it was my serve. I sent a fast serve zooming down the line, and my father dived, but couldn't reach it. 15-love. I served again, and he drove it hard, but hit the net. 30-love. I could see that tortured look on his face again, the anguished desire not to lose. But I didn't care. Jimmy was inside my head, shrieking, "Kill him! Kill him! Kill him! Kill him!" And all I wanted was to win. I served 2 unreturnable aces in a row, and the second had my father skidding face down over the court as he missed it. And I'd won the match. I didn't hear the applause. The rage roaring through my mind had become a great, vindictive shriek of delight as my ghost waited, gloating for my defeated father to raise an embittered, furious, beaten face. Waited for triumph, with all the built-up rage of 40 resentful, dead years. But it didn't happen. Instead, my dad scrambled to his feet, threw down his racket, ran at the net, and jumped over it, just as he had when he'd beaten me. He flung his arms around me in a huge hug, and then pushed me back, holding my shoulders with his hands, looking at me with an enormous, delighted grin, like a little kid faced with a Christmas tree. It occurred to me for an instant that he really was a little kid, much littler than me, somewhere in his head. The delight was absolutely genuine. He said joyfully, "Toby, you're a marvel! I'm so proud of you!" Then he hugged me again and kissed me on the cheek, and I couldn't say a word. On the other side of the fence, I could see my mom, beaming. And gradually I felt all the rage and resentment and hate drain away out of the air around that tennis court and that house. And instead, there was a wonderful, happy astonishment everywhere, and peacefulness, and a small breeze rustling the maple trees against the blue sky. I switched on the computer before I went to bed that night. I typed in, "It's all right now, Jimmy. It's all right. Sleep well." And just for a moment, there were more words on the screen. "I will. Good night, Toby. Play well. Goodbye." Then the screen went dark, and he was gone.
So ends our story for today. I hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday. Bye-bye.